Hello coders, I'm Adam and this is Gosu Coders. Today we're going to be dissecting the JavaScript for loop. Let's get started. Hoo-yah! Alright, the for loop has been around forever. And if you already know about it, you can skip ahead a little bit, but I promise you there's some fun stuff to talk about towards the end. But anyway, for those of you that are wanting a refresher, maybe you're just now learning programming, the for loop is a powerful, powerful tool to keep in your toolbox. And I'm going to talk to you about the basics of it, and then we're going to get into some trickery that JavaScript presents. All right, so the first part of it that executes. So imagine our program is running for the first time, and we get to this line. The very first thing that happens is this is executed. So because we used var, I is actually put on the parent scope. Global scope, function scope, however this for loop actually lives, I is going to be accessible even beyond this for loop. So we'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. So this fires off first. I has been set to 0. The next thing that fires off before it even goes in the for loop is this. So this is number 1. This is number 2. All right, so this goes, then this goes. It's important to note that this needs to come down to something like conditional. So it needs to return true or false. This doesn't necessarily need to do that, nor does this. And in fact, these can be empty if you want them to be. But that we can jump into on another video. All right, so anyway, we've come in, we've initialized our I, we've verified that I is less than 10. So now what are we going to do? We're actually going to run this code. And this code is especially tricky, and it's something that I used to ask JavaScript programmers years ago, because honestly, that's one of the hardest things for people to get their head wrapped around is the asynchronous nature of JavaScript and how scope works. And if someone would nail this question out the gate, granted, we didn't have arrow functions back then. But anyway, if someone nailed this function for me, like I knew that they were a pretty experienced JavaScript programmer back then. All right, so this is fired. Then what ends up happening is this ends, and before the next loop, before this code is ran again, this is ran. So you can think of this as being ran 3rd, then this is being ran 4th, then this would be ran 5th, because we need to verify that I, or that conditional area, in this case I is less than 10, is still valid. So if that succeeds, we go back in here again, so then this would be the 6th thing run. So hopefully that makes sense for how for loops actually work. And take a minute and tell me what you think this is going to print out. And I'm actually going to show you on the screen an example of this in code using var and what that prints out. All right, so hopefully you took some time to really think about that. This is actually going to print out the final value of I. So you are going to get the 10 printouts, but you're going to get 10 every time. And why is that the case? Because you're going to come in and you're eventually going to fail. And the only way that fails with the way that we got this logic set is when I is equal to 10 or more. And you know we're going to hit 10 before we hit any of the other numbers. So we know I is going to be 10. Set timeout. Even though we're not passing in the time, the JavaScript engine will pad it a little bit. Usually the browser will add like, I don't know, 15 milliseconds. They add something, right? There's some sort of time that happens there. So we know that this is going to happen after this for loop. And I is not copied in this. So like the value of I is referenced after all of this is ran. So by the time the set timeout console.log I is ran, we know that I is equal to 10 at that point. But, and there's a big but here, there is an interesting change that has happened over the last few iterations of JavaScript, and that is the introduction of the let. So let introduces something with a tighter scope. And if you think about it, it's called Lexical Scope. And JavaScript has something called lexing time. And lexing time really is, you can think about it, an author-defined scope or life of some variable or object that you've created. And let tightens that up. So how I said var is on the function scope or the global scope, let is not. It's in a lexical scope. So you run this same code with let, you're going to get what you probably thought was the first answer. You're going to get the numbers 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 printed out. And that might blow your mind a little bit, but that shows you the intricacies of scoping, and it also shows you the intricacies of what a for loop actually can involve. So now, why is this important? There's a couple things. It's really good habit to scope everything as small as possible. So I think a good way to think about that is using let whenever possible is probably the right thing. I do want to say that when this runs, a new lexical scope is being created every time the for loop is being entered. So there is a cost to that. Now, I don't know what that cost is, but the fact that a new I is being created, a new scope is being created for every one of those times that this is running, and a copy of I is basically getting made. So you can think about it that I is actually getting, a new lexical scope is getting created, the old value of I is getting copied in, then the value is being incremented. So in that new lexical scope, when this runs, that value of I is pointing to the right value of I. Very, very, very tricky. But honestly, getting back to kind of my point around this, is even those of us that have been programming forever, things like this will throw you off, because I'm an old school programmer that learned years ago. For loops have been a super simple part of my programming toolbox. And honestly, learning about the changes that have happened and now you have to think about scope in JavaScript is really cool, because it harkens back to the days of when I had to really use this in other programming languages, and JavaScript's just getting more and more refined. Run this code, play around with different scopes, and I would love if someone that has been programming a while could actually tell me, is there a big impact in using let versus var in a situation like this? I've tried doing some performance tests and it's really negligible. I'm wondering if it's only going to be an issue with like larger objects, where like primitive objects, basically like integers, really aren't going to matter. Another thing to point out is the keyword constant or const also does the same thing with lexical scope. And you could in theory do const I is equal to 0, but it would fail when I++ is being executed. Another cool thing is you could leave this blank here, and maybe you're doing something else in here and there's some other conditional. Maybe you need to initialize 4 or 5 variables here. You can do all of that in a for loop. Anyway, I'm going to show you some examples on the screen. Anyway, that's all I've got for today. Hopefully you had fun talking about for loops with me. Till next time, everyone, keep coding. Oh, and if you haven't subscribed, please do so. That would mean the world to me. Take care, guys.